The Siachen conflict, which began in 1984, continues in a frozen state of armed vigilance, represents one of the most extreme and revealing manifestations of modern geopolitics, where strategy, geography, and human endurance intersect at the very limits of survivability. Centered on the Centered on the Siachen Glacier in the eastern Karakoram Range, the conflict is not defined by frequent firefights or territorial expansion in the conventional sense, but by the relentless contest to occupy, supply, and psychologically dominate the highest battlefield on Earth. At altitudes ranging from roughly 18,000 to 23,000 feet, Siachen is less a piece of land than a hostile physical system, one that imposes enormous costs simply for the privilege of presence. Control here is not symbolic, it is structural, shaping the security architecture of the Western Himalayas. The origin of the conflict lie in the ambiguous cartography left behind after the 1949 Karachi Agreement and the 1972 Shimla Agreement, both of which delineated the line of control between India and Pakistan only up to the map point NJ9842, after which the line was vaguely described as running thence north to the glaciers. This ambiguity created a strategic vacuum. Pakistan interpreted the undefined region as running northeast towards the Karakoram Pass, while India viewed it as extending northward along the Saltoro Ridge. For years, the difference remained theoretical, largely because the terrain itself appeared uninhabitable and militarily irrelevant. That assumption proved false once high-altitude warfare technology improved and regional geopolitics hardened. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Pakistan began taking incremental steps to legitimize its claim over Siachen by permitting foreign mountaineering expeditions to approach the glacier from the west and north. These expeditions, while ostensibly civilian, were marked on international maps as having been taken place in Pakistan-administered territory, gradually reinforcing Pakistan's narrative through cartographic repetition. India recognized this as a classic case of salami slicing in a domain where legal claims were fragile and physical occupation would eventually become decisive. Intelligence inputs further indicated that Pakistan was preparing for a more direct military move, including procurement of specialized high-altitude equipment. India's response was Operation Meghdoot, launched in April 1984, a preemptive military deployment aimed at seizing the key passes and ridgelines of the Saltoro Ridge of the Saltoro Range before Pakistan could do so. The operation was logistically audacious and strategically blunt. Occupy first, argue later. Troops of the Indian Army, supported by the Indian Air Force, were airlifted by light helicopters into zones where rotor lift is marginal and engine failure often fatal. Within days, Indian forces established control over critical passes such as the Bilafon La and Siala regions, effectively dominating the western approaches to the Siachen Glacier. Pakistan, arriving too late, found itself forced to operate from lower and tactically inferior positions. What followed was not a traditional war, but a prolonged conquest of attrition against terrain, climate, and logistics. Pakistan launched multiple attempts to dislodge Indian positions through the 1980s, including assaults on forward posts perching on sheer ice walls. The most notable of these culminated in the battle for Kaith Post, later named as Bana Post, after the Indian soldiers who led its capture. The operation underscored a harsh reality of Siachen warfare. Victory depends less on firepower than on acclimatization, vertical mobility, and the capacity to sustain human bodies in an environment fundamentally hostile to life. The human cost of Siachen deployment had been staggering. Though often misunderstood, contrary to popular perceptions, the majority of casualties on both sides have not resulted from combat, but from environmental factors. Extreme cold leads to frostbite, severe enough to necessitate amputations. Thin air causes high-altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema. Avalanches and crevasses claim lives without warning. At these altitudes, even routine tasks such as walking, digging, or maintaining equipment demand extraordinary caloric intake and physiological resilience. Soldiers lose weight rapidly, suffer cognitive impairment, and operate under constant risk of sudden death unrelated to enemy action. Despite these costs, India has maintained uninterrupted control over the Saltoro Ridge for 4 decades. This persistence is not driven by sentiment or prestige, but by cold strategic calculation. Control of Siachen prevents a direct physical link between Pakistani and Chinese forces in the Karakoram region, denying them the ability to coordinate or project power across the axis. It also secures India's northern approaches to Ladakh and Nubra Valley, creating strategic depth against both Western and Northern adversaries. Any withdrawal without ironclad verification mechanisms would risk immediate occupation by the opposing side, rendering demilitarization proposals strategically untenable. The conflict has also had broader geopolitical implications. Siachen illustrates how undefined borders in extreme terrain can become flashpoints where regional rivalries intensify. It highlights the limit of diplomatic agreements that defer clarity in favor of temporary stability. More importantly, it demonstrates that in certain contexts, physical occupation becomes the ultimate arbiter of sovereignty, regardless of legal argument. Maps follow boots, not the other way around. From a military perspective, Siachen has reshaped doctrine of high-altitude warfare. India has developed specialized training, medical protocols, clothing systems, and logistical chains designed specifically for sustained operations above 18,000 feet. These capabilities later proved relevant in other sectors of the Himalayan frontier, particularly during standoffs with China. The glacier thus functions not only as a defensive barrier but as a live laboratory for extreme environment military adaptation. Environmentally, the prolonged militarization of Siachen has extracted a heavy toll. Fuel dumps, waste disposal, and the sheer presence of thousands of troops have contributed to glacial degradation in a region already vulnerable to climate change. Both India and Pakistan have acknowledged this damage in principle, yet neither is willing to accept the strategic risk inherent in unilateral or purely verified withdrawal. As a result, environmental concerns remain subordinated to security imperatives, a trade-off that reflects the hierarchy of state priorities in contested borderlands. In the final analysis, the Siachen conflict is not about conquest, nationalism, or even active warfare. It is about denial, leverage, and endurance. It represents a form of conflict where the objective is not to advance but to prevent the adversary from doing so, even at extraordinary cost. Operation Meghdoot sets the logic in motion, and every year since has reinforced the same conclusion. In certain strategic environments, withdrawal is more dangerous than persistence. Siachen endures a frozen testament to the principle that geography, once weaponized, can lock rivals into stalemates, measured not in battles won but in decades survived.